Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third C.D. Deshmukh Memorial Lecture. This has now become a regular feature of February for NCAER. And we are very privileged to have a very distinguished guest and a long-term friend of mine and a friend of NCAER and a friend of India here with us. I'll introduce him in a minute, and we have an equally distinguished commentator. But I want to take a few minutes first to perhaps share with you why we have a C.D. Deshmukh lecture. As those of you who know India's economic history probably know that there are a number of C.D. Deshmukh lectures, actually, 3 at last count, apart from this one. And of course, our immediate connection with Mr. Deshmukh is the fact that he was a founding father of NCER. He was actually India's finance minister at that time. But when you think about all the things that that Chintaman Dwarkanath Deshmukh did in his life, it really is enough to fill many contemporary lives, certainly. He was the first Indian, of course, to be appointed governor of the Reserve Bank of India and straddle the period, the pre-independence to the post-independence period. He was the leading delegate to the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference that established the World Bank and the IMF. Then he served as the Union Finance Minister during 1950 to 1956 under Nehru, which is when he helped found NCER. He later served as the chairman of the University Grants Commission, vice chancellor of Delhi University. In 1959 was awarded the first Magsaysay Award to go to an Indian for distinguished government service. A little known fact, which we often mention when we talk about C.D. Deshmukh, is in between his resignation from the Union Cabinet and his appointment to the University Grants Commission, he was asked if he would be considered, if he would be willing to be considered as the managing director of the IMF. And of course, had he agreed and had he been appointed, the trajectory of the IMF and the World Bank's leadership would have taken a different turn. And I'm now talking of the late 50s. So in so many ways, C.D. Deshmukh really represents the best that Indian civil servants and Indian intellectuals have to offer. And we are, of course, very privileged to be doing the C.D. Deshmukh Memorial Lectures every year. As I said, we have a very distinguished speaker today, and he is going to talk about a very pressing and interesting issue that looms large on the horizon, and this is the move from the Millennium Development Goals to whatever will ensue this September. David Malone is the rector of the United Nations University and the UN Under-Secretary General. He's had a very distinguished career prior to joining the UN as a Canadian diplomat, and most recently as the president of the International Development Research Centre, Canada's development research funding arm. He recently published International Development Ideas, Practice and Prospects at Oxford University, which is a near encyclopedic survey of the topic, which he has co-edited with Ravi Kanbur, Rohinton Madora, and Bruce Curry Alder. As a career Foreign Service officer, he served as Canada's envoy to India and also to Bhutan and Nepal, and of course Canada's ambassador to the UN from 1992 to 94. David represents, in my mind, one of the finest thinkers and also a mesmerizing speaker. So we look forward very much to what he has to say, an insider's view of the debates that are currently ongoing on what shape the MDGs will take as we approach the September summit. And I will introduce my colleague Nitin Desai when I hand in the floor. David.
Great. Should I speak from the podium or from here?
Whatever suits you better.
Perhaps easier for people to see me if I speak from here. And are these on? Yes, they are on. Shekhar, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. It's great to have friends in the audience. It's also very daunting, and I was mentioning to Nitin that speaking about Millennium Development Goals in front of him as he was present when they were formulated is a very dangerous avocation, and he's bound to denounce all of my distortions. But I'm thrilled he agreed to be here today. I'm a huge fan of his. NCAER is an extraordinary institution, and it stands out for being able to do something I'm terrible at in spite of studying accounting, which is that it does quantitative work. Of course, it does much more than quantitative work, but its ability to do quantitative work of the highest order is something quite rare, even in capitals as sophisticated as Delhi. And it also, over the years, has had a succession of extraordinary leaders. Suman Berry is with us, and he was one of them. Also extraordinary presidents. The current one, Nandan Nilekani, follows a long line of very distinguished predecessors. And all of them just tremendously committed to the work. And when you're on the outside of an institution looking at it, that's very, very impressive, because many institutions are about one person. It's a vanity project of this person or that person. It's a fly-by-night notion that is being indulged. But NCAER really has stuck with its core mandate very, very impressively. And when I was working at IDRC, of course, and I have a number of colleagues from IDRC in the room, including its regional director for Asia, Anandya Chatterjee, NCAER was a very important partner for us, as it remains. Now, today's talk is going to be a very strange mixture of the personal and the more abstract, because actually development, in spite of being a Canadian, has woven itself into and out of my life at various stages. And the book on which I collaborated with Ravi Ganbour, known to so many of you, wonderful partner in any enterprise, Rohinton Medora, likewise, and Bruce Curry-Alder, was for us a luxury, because we took 4 years to chart what had been the ideas driving international development efforts since the early 1950s, how these ideas had been transformed with experience derived from their application on the ground, because the ideas often turned out not to be so hot when put into practice. Indeed, the field of development is a field largely of trial and error, with a great deal of error as one goes along. So for us, it was a huge luxury. We had wonderful authors, most of them from the developing world, many of them young and new voices. By the way, this posed a problem for us with our wonderful publishing house, OUP in Oxford, because when we sent in our plan and table of contents, we'd put possible author names next to possible chapters. And it was peer-reviewed, of course, and the peer reviewing was done, as is often the case, by very distinguished and rather ancient people from the field. And they came back and said, yes, this is really interesting, but we don't know any of these people. And we were thrilled. Of course you don't know any of these people. They're a new crop of people. And that's what we constantly need to be looking for in institutions like NCAER, in the academic world, and so on. So that kept me focused mainly through the lens of our terrific authors, because I would personally have been altogether incapable of producing what they did on the study of development ideas for a number of years. Fascinating and also sobering, frankly. Now, I threatened to speak a bit of personal experiences, and I'm going to mention two relevant to development from my early life. When I was 8 years old, my parents went to live in a fabulous country, a country I still love deeply, and that country was Iran. And today, it's very hard to imagine, some of us are old enough to remember, that in 1961, it was the poster child of development. It was doing everything right. The experts were unanimous. This was a huge success story. And as the final proof needed, all of the indicators pointed to success. Now, there were a few discordant notes. There was a group of Iranian and French anthropologists and sociologists who published in obscure journals nobody read that, in fact, Iranian society was under huge strain, that the recipe of a forced march towards Western-style modernization, far from being a huge success in India's rural hinterlands, was creating a great deal of discomfort and unhappiness. These articles, of course, were comprehensively ignored, as was, a year after we arrived in Iran, a very violent set of riots throughout several of the major cities of Iran in the summer of 1963, June of 1963. These had been fomented, by the way, by somebody we were to hear more from later, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was sitting in the holy city of Qom and who found all of these Western ideas inconvenient and unsettling. The riots, which took many lives, and interestingly, many of the lives that were taken were lives of women in professional jobs, since part of the project of modernization involved an accelerated emancipation of women in Iran. So many women bank tellers and in other jobs like that were killed by the rioters. All of this was ignored as a blip, as something not mattering at all, because it was self-evident and demonstrated by the indicators and all the rest of it that the modernization project was a huge success. We all know how the story ended in 1978. In the meanwhile, growing numbers of dissidents in, principally, by the way, in the upper middle from the upper middle classes, swelled the jails in Iran, were being executed. Some of my classmates were executed. When your classmates start being executed, by the way, you know something is wrong in a society in the world. So as I traveled back to Iran as an older teenager, I realized something was very, very wrong in the country. And the something was a very basic rejection of this plan and the implementation of the plan of Western-style modernization of the country. Unfortunately, it was a very terrible way for Iran to emancipate itself from the project, because it's still under the yoke of what is a reaction to what preceded 1978, and not too happy to be under that yoke. Of course, at the age of 8, I didn't have a political consciousness. Even at the age of 13, I was a bit more interested, but not yet able to digest any of this. But because I kept on, given my love of the country, returning to the country's trajectory made a very profound impression on me, created great suspicion in me of consensus, particularly great suspicion of consensus in the so-called development community, and made me extremely cautious about making judgments with respect to societies I had no particular way of understanding. My second experience was a bit different. It involves another wonderful country with terrific people, and that country is Sudan. When I was a young professional, somebody in my capital called me up one day. I was sitting in Cairo minding my own business, and said, you know, we seem to have nobody in Sudan running our aid program. Why don't you go to Sudan and run our aid program? I was 23 at the time. So I said, why not? And off I went to Sudan. And our aid program, which was a very large one for the time, about $30 million a year, which was real money back then, essentially supported 6 projects which spanned a gamut of activities: dryland farming, road building, forestry inventory towards forest conservation. All good things, or so we thought. They were proceeding quite nicely, I thought, on balance, in spite of the political turbulence in the country. And when I left Sudan, I was moderately optimistic for them. 25 years later, I returned to Sudan, and it occurs to me it might be nice to go and see what happened to these projects. Had they been helpful? Actually, they had disappeared altogether. There was no trace of any of them. Not even the roads we had built was there any trace of. So this inspires reflection, and I asked one or two of my Sudanese friends, because they're extraordinarily warm people who form friendships easily, what they thought had gone wrong. And they said, well, you know, we didn't have a lot of ideas on development, and you probably did have lots of ideas on development. So it may be that well-meaning Canadians turned up and wanted to do something to help us, and we didn't have any clear ideas, so you suggested road building and dryland farming and other good things. But in fact, we are a pastoralist country. What matters here is cattle. And cattle don't need roads. Cattle don't even need forests. And dryland farming is the enemy of cattle because it actually displaces them. And so perhaps you didn't really understand us so well. Perhaps we didn't. So another cautionary tale fairly early in my professional life. And later in my career, I worked on multilateral economic diplomacy, G20, very high-minded stuff. IDRC was a fabulous interlude, mainly because I learned so much during my time at IDRC. It was like a 5-year tutorial late in life from which I learned a huge amount. And the capitals in which I served my country, with the exception of New York, where I was ambassador for a while, were in the developing world: Cairo, Damascus, Amman, and eventually New Delhi. Best of all for me, as I love India. Now, coming to the topic of this evening, but I wanted to first give you a sense of my prejudices before I got into the topic of this evening. The Millennium Development Goals now beginning to morph into Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals emerged, Nitin would know more, but emerged in a strange way. They emerged as an annex to a report of the Secretary General, to a rather grumpy General Assembly, which responded grumpily 4 or 5 months later in early 2002 that perhaps these goals were a reasonable roadmap towards the future. Now, the goals had very carefully been drawn from a declaration of the Millennium Summit, so Kofi Annan and his colleagues were on strong grounds in being able to point to factors that member states themselves had come up with or at least blessed. The targets also were mostly mentioned in the Millennium Declaration, but a set of useful indicators by which the attainment or non-attainment of the targets could be measured were developed by a small group of people quietly. Nitin was probably involved in New York. And the whole package basically slipped onto the international scene virtually unnoticed. I defy many of you to tell me how deeply engaged you were in the Millennium Development Goals in 2002. In fact, it was only with the Gleneagles G8 Summit in 2005 and some associated activity relating to debt forgiveness, accelerated debt forgiveness of heavily indebted, very poor countries, that the Millennium Development Goals acquired some energy. So very late launch of serious implementation. And as a result, the goals, which had the benefit of being easy to understand with a limited number of clear targets and indicators that were serious indicators, will mostly not be attained by the end of this year. How were they useful? Well, they were useful in a country like India because they were seized upon by various constituents within society. Civil society in India often would seize on a particular goal in order to articulate its demands of the government. And during my years in Delhi, I noticed it being quite effective because the demand would be fairly clear, rooted in something that could be measured, and so it was useful that way. Secondly, if you know how governments work, and you all do, certain ministries would latch on to a particular goal that suited them, argue for more money to work on that goal, often get more money to work on that goal, and that would help along the track of implementation of whatever that goal was in India as elsewhere. The goals that, or at least the targets that were met, the most spectacular one is the halving of the number of ultra-poor in the world in the 15 years from 2000 to 2015, was of course met not quite in the way that was intended as a broadly based phenomenon, but actually by China lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty during those years. And by the way, India also lifting quite a number of ultra-poor out of that category during those years. But it can't be said that the headline figure is particularly descriptive of what was going on all over the world. So were the Millennium Goals helpful rather than unhelpful? My argument would be that they were helpful, but had an under-energized launch, and only belatedly did a number of constituencies, I think, wake up to their potential. No risk of that this time around, in the sense that the last set of goals had only one goal dealing clearly with the environment. And the climate change and other environmental constituencies wanted to make sure that would never be the case again. So at the Rio +20 conference, in a very tactically astute way, this particular constituency agitated mightily to start, in effect, the process of articulating what the next generation of goals should be. First of all, they should be sustainable development goals, not surprising view at a Rio +20 conference. Secondly, interesting idea, they should apply to all countries, not just to developing countries. And I think it's a profound shift, because thinking of my country, Canada, we have done a number of things reasonably well since the Second World War, but there are some things we have failed at shockingly. For example, helping in the development of our Aboriginal communities, which still languish way behind the rest of society. So Canada has a lot of progress to make too on development, if you look again beyond the headline figures. So that was one idea. The next idea that I think is important came indirectly in the report of a high-level panel that Ban Ki-moon convened in, I can't remember which year, perhaps 2013. It was led by the president of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, the recent president of Indonesia, and David Cameron of the UK. It had a very good staff led by Homi Kharas, who many of you know, and the staff reached out a lot to people they knew whose ideas they valued. And a very thoughtful report analytically emerged. And one of the ideas that came through, and I'll come back to it later in my remarks, was that no longer should the obsession be simply quantity of kids in school, for example. It should also be about quality of social services, quality of what governments and others were offering to the development project. Again, a very profound shift, and I'll come back to it. In a sense, less helpfully, the high-level panel felt it should develop some indicative goals of its own, which were perfectly reasonable goals, but instead of 8 of them, there were 12 of them, with lots of targets and indicators, all of them interesting, but that's a lot of goals, targets, and indicators. The member states of the UN, who are very much in charge of the organization, felt that they were being sidelined by a lot of this activity. They should be in charge. And through an open working group of the member states, set to think about what the member states thought the goals and targets might be. Very well intentioned, and some of the work useful, but unfortunately the package that emerged, in my personal view, was unfortunate. First of all, 17 goals. You tell me which government you think can focus on 17 goals and delivering on them. Worse, 169 targets, many of them unscientific, others without content, others making no sense whatsoever. 169 targets and no indicators. Ban Ki-moon labored mightily with his excellent advisor on the post-2015 development planning, wonderful Nigerian woman called Amina Mohammed, to try to make some sense of all of this. They came up with 6 imperatives, which somehow gathered this mass of input under an umbrella of 6 headings. But basically, in a sense, the member states are, I think, wedded to their 17 goals, so that's probably what we'll get. The targets, I think they've accepted, will not fly, and there is an idea to bring the Statistical Commission of the UN, which contains quite a lot of expertise, with more expertise on call from the national statistical commissions and so on, to look at the targets and perhaps weed out the ones that aren't scientific or actively anti-scientific, make them somewhat more respectable, and perhaps develop some indicators that could be useful. Now, there's another profound shift that has been occurring, in fact 2 I'll mention, that are pertinent and extremely hopeful, at least for the developing world. The first is that development has actually been occurring. The 1980s had been such a terrible decade for development, and the 1990s only marginally better for much of the world, that in the year 2000, at the time of the Millennium Summit, development still seemed an elusive, broadly based development still seemed an elusive, worthy, but in some way faintly unlikely project. But actually, since the year 2000, there's been a great deal of development. The Chinese success story consolidated. India accelerated further for much of that period. Africa, which had been the disaster zone of development for so long, actually started performing in a sustained way in the 5 to 6% growth rate sense for over 10 years. And it takes 5 to 6% growth to make a meaningful difference, we've discovered, because otherwise you're barely keeping track with population growth, so you're not really growing at all. But Africa had been growing unevenly, but in the aggregate very significantly. And Latin America had been progressing in other ways. If you think of Brazil, the economic growth story may not be so striking, but the social development story in Brazil has been tremendously exciting. So development really took off after the year 2000. But that's rather unsettling in a way, because if development's taken off, what does that mean for all these recipes that people want to come up with? Did the reality of development correspond to any of the prescriptions, let's say, that the experts, international institutions, and others had formulated and propagated? The other big shift, not bad for the developing world, but not great for the industrialized world, is that since the year 2008, so that's now 7 years, friends, the industrialized world has been in a fairly deep crisis. And while the United States is beginning, we hope, to emerge from that crisis with very serious employment creation figures and other indicators that suggest the worst may be over for the US, we know the worst is probably not yet over for Europe. Japan, which is an extraordinary society, has not recovered economically yet from its extended flirtation with deflation. And while Abenomics is making a very brave stab at overcoming that problem, the truth is none of us know what the outcome will be. So the industrialized world is in a profound extended economic period of questioning and, in many places, virtual stagnation. In many places, including Japan, with worrying demographic trends in terms of aging societies, not something India needs to worry about just yet, but which may turn into a challenge here one day. And so the fact that the developing world, by and large, has been doing quite well, there is a counterpart to the story, which is that without significant consumption in the industrialized world, there may be a limit to how extensively well the developing world will be able to continue to do should the difficulties in the West persist. And they may persist because they seem to be persisting in Europe and one or two other places. Now, I said I would come back to issues of quality. And I'm going to end pretty well with this because I'm much more interested in the exchange with all of you in Nitin's remarks, which will be a whole lot more interesting than mine. But if you look back at the Millennium Development Goals, what did they have to say about education? Millennium Development Goal 2 simply advocated universal primary education, ensuring universal primary education. An admirable goal, but we're surprised today, 15 years later, that that's all the Millennium Development Goals said at the goal level about education, partly because there's been so much development since 2000. What does the draft text, the member state draft, have to say about education? Something quite different. It says that, and I think it's goal 4, I could be wrong, that the goal is to ensure equitable, quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all. Now measure the difference in ambition between the first goal and this goal. Also, the thought that went into it, because the reality is that while some of us in this room have been fortunate to be able to practice more or less the same profession throughout our lives, it's very unlikely that our children and grandchildren will be in the same case, because change in economies has been accelerating. And it's been accelerating pretty constantly, the change in our economies. So the idea that you're educated once and for all when you get your BA or your MA or your PhD is probably profoundly delusional for the world we're going into. And so this goal reflects some awareness that, be it vocational training or be it higher education, it's going to have to be retooled several times in a lifetime. So I found that actually very encouraging as somebody who has an interest in higher education policy, that the ambition is greater. Not all kids are in school yet. But this is accompanied, and I'll end on that, with a growing focus on universities and quality teaching in universities. Why can I advance that idea? Well, a couple of years ago, I sat in on a terrific meeting that the Japanese government organizes every few years with African leaders of one sort or another. It's called TICAD. And TICAD occurred shortly after I went to live in Tokyo. And I went to it, and I sat in on a number of meetings with leaders, along with Ban Ki-moon. And it was noticeable that for these leaders, higher education was quite important. whereas the African leaders I had known as a young man considered higher education the enemy. Why? Because that's where dissent came from in their countries. Universities were havens for troublemakers. We couldn't have that. So Idi Amin single-handedly destroys Makerere University. It's been reviving, even though President Museveni may not be the most convincing Democrat alive. He is reinvesting quite heavily in the universities, particularly Makerere, of Uganda. Why? Because there's an understanding that without higher education and without educating your own people at home, rather than sending them off to Harvard never to return, you simply are foreclosing on your greatest assets. Secondly, all eyes have been on Asia, in Latin America to some extent, and certainly in Africa. And what do Africans notice when they look at Asia? Amongst other things, they notice very significant investment in tertiary education in countries like Malaysia. They notice those two great city-states of our era, Hong Kong and Singapore, investing huge sums in their universities. And they also notice Hong Kong and Singapore prospering, having become knowledge hubs. So there is now an actual ambition in places that weren't dreaming of it 25 years ago to become, if not global knowledge hubs, at least national ones, sub-regional ones, perhaps continent-scale ones. And governments are beginning to make strategic investments, not giving the same money to every institution, actually differentiating and beginning to give more to the institutions that demonstrate they can absorb more and use more intelligently. So all of this again speaks to profound change of a very positive and hopeful sort. Shekhar, I'll knock off now and look forward to hearing from Nitin and anybody in the room who would care to denounce me. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think pronouncements may be more in order than denouncements. This has been one of the most refreshing reviews of, and an insider's review of how we have come to where we have come. And your involvement inside and on the sidelines of this really is an extraordinary account of where the world is heading with these sustainable development goals. Nitin Desai hardly needs an introduction. He's one of India's best-known economists and international civil servants with an illustrious career in government here and with the United Nations. He's currently a distinguished fellow at TERI and was UN Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs from 1992 to 2003. And earlier, the Secretary and Chief Economic Advisor, of course, to the Government of India in the Ministry of Finance. He was Deputy Secretary General to the UN Conference on Environment and Development. He has worked extensively on internet governance, and as a young man was also the Special Economic Advisor to the Brundtland Commission on Environment and Development. Nitin.
Thank you. Thank you, Shekhar. And let me also thank David for being here and giving us an insider's view of what's happening right now in this area. Though what he had to say ranged a lot beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, which is good. And we, of course, knew each other in New York when he was there in the Canadian mission, later when he was here in Delhi. And so it's a great pleasure for me to be here with David. Let me say a word or two on the difference between the atmospherics around the Millennium Development Goals and what's being discussed now. David is absolutely right. The Millennium Development Goals were almost an afterthought attached to the Secretary General's report in the form of an annex. We were all involved in writing that report. The person I would really give most credit for crystallizing these goals is John Ruggie, who was the policy advisor to the Secretary General. The important thing is not a single one of those goals had to be negotiated in the Millennium Declaration. All of those goals came from a much richer, thicker political process over the previous decade in the UN conferences, most of which I was involved in running and organizing. And in that sense, what the member states had to decide was not the goal, but which goals shall we put into this? Halving of poverty, the goals on infant mortality, maternal mortality, all of these had been negotiated earlier. And they were a product of a relatively thick and rich political process. So there was a buy-in. It was not something that any country would complain is something that you are imposing on them, because they were party to it in various summits which the presidents and prime ministers attended. This is not the case with the Sustainable Development Goals. It is not as if they have come from a thick and rich political process of the sort that we had in the UN conferences. So therefore, there is still room to negotiate the numbers. And this is why I think there is going to be much more difficulty in crystallizing a sort of consensus around these goals than we had. I must say that we never thought they would acquire as much of a standing in development matters as they did. We did it more to just provide something which would attract publicity, attention, etc., but it really took off. I really also want to say a word or two on the usefulness, or otherwise, of what I would describe as a target-oriented approach to development management. How useful is it to have these targets? And remember this, that when we did the Millennium Goals, a lot of people felt that we had oversimplified. For instance, take the whole issue of women's advancement. It got reduced to a goal on maternal mortality. And most of the women's groups who have been involved in the Beijing conference and afterwards complained. They say, what's happened to the rest of our policy agenda? You have just picked on one thing, and you cannot say that everything about women's advancement is going to be captured by looking at maternal mortality. Similarly, issues about enrollment and so on. So there is a serious problem in just looking at these things as the only basis for global cooperation on development. And we had to keep asserting that it's not just this, it's all of the different programs of action that you have negotiated and agreed. You find this in a small way in the climate process now. In the climate process, there is more and more focus on a goal. What do I need to do in terms of mitigation to stay within the 2-degree centigrade? But the developing countries keep arguing that's not the only thing. You also have other things that you have in the convention on common but differentiated responsibility, et cetera, all of the primacy of development. Where would all that figure in? So in that sense, we always have to remember that a target-oriented thing has some value, perhaps in crystallizing action and attention, but it needs something much more behind it than what we have been often put into it. I sometimes say that in many ways, with the way the world has moved towards a liberalized market economy, government shouldn't be targeting, not growth rates. These are outcomes of what individual investors' behavior do. That you probably need plan without targeting. Instead, what we're getting is targeting without planning. We've had a bit of this in this country lately, where a grand target is announced and nobody knows whether there's any analysis behind it to see whether it is feasible or not. So I think there are some weaknesses in this whole business of looking at targets as the main organizing principle for development effort, particularly development cooperation. I think David is right to focus on other areas of difference between the year 2000 and 2015. Throughout the 90s, when we were doing the conferences, the general attitude was always that the main engine of global growth is in the West, and that the What we really have to worry about is how do we get the benefits of global growth in the West to improve conditions in developing countries. And by 2000, that had already started changing, but it had not yet registered fully. Because remember this, during the 90s, the US particularly didn't do badly at all. It was doing rather well. And that continued for some time. I think that is the one big change that I see. Today, people are recognizing that actually the engines of global growth have moved. That you ought to be worrying much more about what's going to happen to Chinese growth than what's going to happen to European growth in terms of how it impacts on other people. So in a sense, certain countries like China, to a lesser extent countries like India, their role in the global economy has changed substantially. And you cannot approach development support for these countries in the same way as you did in the year 2000. These are now becoming drivers of global growth rather than people who have to take it from somewhere else. There are also the question that you raised about quality versus quantity, a sense that, look, we had problems of numbers. We have done much there. Now we need to worry about quality. And a good example one could give is in education in India, school education in India, where in some ways we have got the enrollment numbers, but we also know we have huge problems of quality, huge problems of quality. All of these surveys that have come out have shown how poor the quality of education in schools is. Our problem now is not setting up more schools. Our problem now is to improve the quality of education in the schools that we have. It's perhaps a little different when it comes to higher education, where there is still a growth in numbers, which is ahead of us. But certainly school education is a very good example of one where one has to work out a way of shifting attention from quantity to quality. Putting down a target for enrollment is no longer good enough in terms of what we ought to be worrying about. We need goals, and which, if at all, it can be done in terms of goals, it has to be goals of quality. But I'm not sure that quality issues can be resolved through goals. So in that sense, I would suggest that there must be some caution in getting too caught in a target-oriented approach to development cooperation, because then it can lead to distortions. One more thing which I welcome is the shift from Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. What I welcome here is the recognition that you cannot talk about poverty eradication and similar things without at the same time talking about the resources and the integrity of the resources on which poverty eradication depends. Right from the Brundtland onwards, I've been laboring away at this, saying the two have to go together. You cannot protect a resource or conserve a resource somewhere without worrying about the livelihood of the people who depend on that resource for a living. Equally, you cannot improve the lives of the people who depend on that resource for a living without worrying about the conservation of that resource. The two have to go together. Anti-poverty programs and area development programs have to emerge, but that has not happened. What has happened is you have target-oriented programs for poverty eradication with little regard for the resource base on which poverty depends. So you end up giving sewing machines and cows and this and that. But there are lots of links. One very interesting example of a link was what Gertrude Bongela told me in her village in Tanzania, that the biggest impact on the attendance of girls in school was an improvement in water supply. But what happened was that the girls had to go miles away to get water supply for the school. And once they started getting water supply in the village, school attendance shot up. Now, this is one example of how looking at a resource issue, water availability, helps you with a human development issue, which is education for girls. And one of the things I do welcome in the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals and 129 targets is a bit much for anybody to handle. But I do welcome the idea that these two should go together. One more thing, a further thing that one has to welcome is that one big difference between 2015 and 2000 is that we are much closer to planetary boundaries now than we were then. We are much closer to planetary boundaries when it comes to carbon emissions, to the nitrogen cycles, and many other things. I'm not going to go into that. And therefore, it is important that from the point of view of human welfare, we start worrying as much about these, not encroaching on these planetary limits, as we do about human development measures about poverty, education, health, etc., etc. So there are some reasons for welcoming this shift from a essentially anti-poverty targeted approach to something which at least tries to connect poverty, education, health with resource-based issues. But I do hope that they will succeed in reducing these targets to something which is more manageable. And if they do, then I suspect then it would be something which would be of value and of use in organizing development efforts nationally and globally. So let me stop here. I'm sure there are colleagues here who would wish to come in and question David on what he had to say. Thank you very much.